Historian William Davis is the author of this book, Lincoln's Men: How President Lincoln Became Father to an Army and a Nation, our history book selection this weekend. Mr. Davis looked at thousands of letters and diaries written by Civil War soldiers to learn how the Union Army viewed its leader. He spoke about the book at the Book Review bookstore in Huntington, Long Island. First, an introduction.
I think we're about ready to start. First of all, as president of the North Shore Civil War Roundtable, the organization that meets here once a month, and on behalf of Book Review, I know most of you are familiar with it. This lovely bookstore is our meeting place. I'd like to welcome all of our regular members, distinguished guests, and friends to this, our regular February meeting. Also like to extend a special welcome to the folks from C-SPAN who are here to tape our distinguished speaker, historian author William Davis, who prefers to be called Jack. It is the second time the North Shore Civil War Roundtable has had the pleasure of C-SPAN taping our meeting. The last was in May of 1997, when James McPherson from Princeton was our speaker. I have only one announcement, but it's kind of important to us at the Roundtable. It concerns the sign-in book, which is now going to be passed amongst you. For tonight, we only wish to have first-time guests sign our book. Now, lots of people, our regular members, have for the last 4 years been signing their name. We know who you are and we love you. And you've given us your address and you've been on our mailing list for 4 years, and it's nice that you're still living in the same house. But the fact of the matter is, we have to buy new books every time we run out of one. So tonight, please, first-time guests only. Everyone else, members, guests that have been here before, you're on our mailing list. Just let it go by. And first-time guests, give us your name and your mailing address if you'd like to receive one courtesy copy of the February issue of Drumroll, our Roundtable newsletter. And that's really our reason for asking you if you wish that. We'll give you a courtesy mailing, so please sign it. All those who are interested in renewing their membership for $99 and the North Shore Civil War Roundtable, I'm pleased to say the numbers are in, and just keeps growing, and we're delighted. But if you are a member who has not renewed, Jeff Stark is sitting in the far back, and if you like what you've seen, and I know you're going to like what you hear, and if this is your first time in our midst and you'd like to join, well, at the end of the meeting, please see Jeff. $25, your official lapel pin, 20% off on all books at Book Review that are Civil War, etc., etc., and you're in for a year. And you can do that at the end of the meeting. I think it's time we get to the business at hand. So at this time, I'm going to ask our Vice President, Al Hahn, to come up. He's going to introduce our speaker, and he will also explain, you see the white chain over there, the procedure that we use here for the event that follows the event. And that, of course, will be the book signing. I have one more announcement that I omitted that I was asked to make, and I'm pleased to make it. For those of you who live in town, this will certainly, I'm sure, be nothing new for you to know. But Saturday, February the 20th at 8 o'clock, Book Review will be hosting one of Huntington's own, Robert Mrazek. As you will know if you live in the area, he's a former United States member of the House of Representatives from Huntington, and he has a Civil War novel. It's called Stonewall's Gold, and I can't say I've read it. I just haven't gotten to it, but I will, and I've heard very good things about it. And Bob Mrazek, of course, for those of you in Huntington and Suffolk, he's one of our own. And he'll be here not as a roundtable event, but as a book review speaker Again, the date is Saturday, February the 20th, and without further ado, I'd like Al to come up to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Cass. Before we go on with our presentation and my introduction, I just want to advise you once again, if you want the book, Lincoln's Men, we have a supply in the back desk. Please buy them before you queue up to have it signed by Jack Davis. Well, we're really honored to have a speaker of the reputation of Jack. But before I introduce him, I'd like to thank the following people for exercising such great flexibility during the last couple of weeks in making this event happen. Richard and Robert Klein and their staff here at Book Review. Mark Adler for his willingness to change his presentation date to March 4th. Barbara Gross, who can't be here this evening, for generating a special label printing and taking time from her busy schedule to get that list to me for overnighting an overnight delivery to the Free Press. The people of Free Press themselves, especially Anayo Afalabi, who I've spoken to so many times and couldn't be here tonight, for rising to the occasion, creating a special mailing for us to alert our membership of the program change on such short notice. And of course, Jack himself for accepting our fax invitation without really knowing much about the North Shore Civil War Roundtable. So much for the accolades. We are so pleased to have Mr. Davis here tonight to talk with us about Lincoln's Men. His new book, which takes the Union soldier from chuckling at the sight of the tall, gawky, hayseed president to, as one soldier said, the ideal of the Army. We know Jack is a distinguished historian, prolific writer, and editor of some 36 Civil War and Southern history books, a twice Pulitzer nominee, magazine publishing executive, and regular consultant to television Civil War Journal and the History Channel. In addition, Jack was made a Fellow of the Royal Photographic Society of Great Britain in 1985. It's quite a full plate. Jack, tell us how Abraham Lincoln became Father Abraham to the Union soldier.
Thank you. How did Father Abraham become father to the Union soldier? It sounds like you're asking me for a lecture on the birds and the bees. I'd like to, first of all, thank you all for coming here. It's lovely to see so many people. Obviously, none of you were coming here via American Airlines, which is what I have to use to try to get someplace in a couple of days. I've spoken in a lot of unusual venues over the years. I was thinking about this on the drive over here this evening. Old saloons, churches, not simultaneously, I hasten to add, from the bow of a steamboat holding a handheld microphone. But I think this is the first time I, a professional writer, first time I've ever given a talk in a bookstore. And it may prove disconcerting, not because of the view you have, but because of the view I have. If 2/3 of the way through this talk I break down in tears, it might be because I'm so moved by my own eloquence. Or it might be that I can see the people at the cash registers, and if they ain't buying my books, I'll be severely disappointed. All over the country tonight, people are getting up to give talks in front of plumbers' conventions and meetings of certified public accountants and school teachers' meetings and PTAs and everything else. And I can practically guarantee that every speaker tonight is going to open up talking about something with no relation whatever to his topic, and that is going to be a joke about what's happening in Washington. Well, I see nothing funny about it, so I'm not going to make any joke. But then that also, in fact, is sort of the topic that I'm here to talk about. We're only 4 hours away from Abraham Lincoln's 190th birthday. Abraham Lincoln had a lot to do with defining what the presidency is, and it may not be inappropriate that we're going to talk a little bit about the impact he had on his nation at a time when something is about to go on that may continue to have considerable impact on the nation he fought so hard to preserve, and on the presidency that he, as much as any president in our history, helped to define. One of the questions that Civil War historians are constantly bedeviled with are the what-if questions. And they're usually couched not in what-if terms, but in the sort of terms of, well, did the North have to win the war? Could the South have won if Lee had won at Gettysburg? Could the South have won if Longstreet hadn't been late on the second day at Gettysburg? Could the South have won if Lee had had the H-bomb? You begin to get the drift of the questions. They're not particularly serious. They are questions saying, please, please, please give me some way in which the South could have won. And corollary to that is the notion that the South would have won but for Longstreet being late at Gettysburg, but for Jefferson Davis being a dreadful president, and all the rest. It's often forgotten that it was probably the people on the other side of Mason and Dixon's line who had as much to do with the South losing as did Jefferson Davis. Years after the war, when the Gettysburg controversy continued to rage, people kept asking Southern soldiers who were at Gettysburg, why did you lose? What did you do that was wrong? What caused you to lose the war? Was Lee sick? Was Longstreet late? Blah, blah, blah. And one of them said, well, you know, I think maybe it had something to do with General Meade and 90,000 Yankees. And it also had something to do, when it came to the South winning the war, with Abraham Lincoln, with how, in the face of years of defeat, he managed to keep men volunteering for the Army, and how once they volunteered, he, as much as, if not more than anyone else, managed to keep them in the Army to the end. Remember that by the time the Civil War broke out, the United States, the Union, had no real military tradition. Certainly no professional military tradition. The Revolution was fought almost entirely by volunteers. There was a little attempt at conscripting, but it really didn't work in the era of the Revolution. After the War of the Revolution, the Army disappeared. In 1787, there was no United States Army. There were a few disparate state militias. Came war with Britain again in 1812. The United States Army had a grand total of 6,000 soldiers. Eventually, 500,000 men would volunteer to fight in that war, in spite of the fact, in spite of the fact that, once again, there was no overall coordination. And when the war was winding down, that army of 500,000 was actually deteriorating and starting to fall apart. It was not American valor at arms that won the War of 1812. It was the distraction provided by Napoleon and war on the continent that granted us the respite that made it worth England's while to let us go in favor of a much greater, for them, much greater goal. The War with Mexico came along in 1846, 1848. Once again, the American military is minuscule and is not prepared for it. Still operating on a militia system that had been in place since 1792, and with no true national militia system. As a result, come 1861, and it's the same story over and over again. Now, Lincoln himself, prior to 1861, had a considerable interest in the military. Every boy in his age wanted to be a soldier. And Lincoln, of course, got to be a soldier twice for a period of a few weeks each time. Once he was a captain of militia in Illinois during the war with the Sauk and Fox, the so-called Black Hawk War. And again, after being a captain, he went back into the ranks a few weeks later as a private. Not many examples of men who go in as officers and who re-up to become privates later on. That probably says something either about his humility or his quality as a captain, since officers were elected in those days. But still, Lincoln the soldier experienced some little bits of what the soldier's life was like. He saw the way the American volunteer, these raw young civilians who were never really soldiers but were just kind of civilians on loan to the Army, he saw how they behaved in a military situation. He saw the disorderliness that volunteers were prone to. He saw the independence that you could never discipline out of the American volunteer. He saw men be drunk. He saw them desert. He was himself actually disciplined once for not maintaining discipline in his own command. He had his military sword taken away from him and instead was forced to march around for a day holding a mock wooden sword. Very humiliating to a young volunteer officer from Illinois. When the War with Mexico came along, he in fact opposed the war, and it helped to guarantee that he would not win re-election after his one term in Congress. But when it came to the support of the soldiers themselves, the volunteers who were in that war, Lincoln voted in favor of every military bill for pay, for supplies, for relief to those soldiers. He could make the distinction between a war that he thought was bad and the benefit of the soldiers who were forced to go out and carry out the will of their country. 13 years later, he faced his own war. And interestingly enough, he was already preparing himself for it and trying to prepare his people for it before he took office. You all know the story of Lincoln's long trip from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington to take the oath of office as president. All along the way, he made a speech every day, sometimes 2 or 3 speeches a day in 2 or 3 different cities. He lived on a railroad car and was speaking constantly from the back of that car. And in every one of these talks, he tried to prepare the people before him for what might be before them. He was not saber-rattling, but he was trying to give them an admonition that there could be a long and bloody trial ahead of them, and that they would be called upon, the men would be called upon, to step forward in the case of a true national crisis and do as their forefathers had done in the war with Mexico or the 2 wars with Britain. And still there is no national militia system. And the United States Army, when Lincoln takes office, consists of 13,000 soldiers spread all across 3,000 miles of the United States in little frontier outposts from Fort Monroe all the way to San Francisco. In short, there was no United States Army. In fact, on March 4th, 1861, when Lincoln took the oath of office, the growing Confederate Army outnumbered the Union Army. If they'd attacked then, they might have won. There's the answer to your question. How does the South win? But they wait until April, and where they attack is Fort Sumter. And you all know what happens in a national explosion. Lincoln immediately puts out the call for 75,000 volunteers. And he does it with no congressional authority because Congress is not sitting. Prior to that time, it required congressional sanction for a president to issue a call for volunteers. But Lincoln took advantage of the fact that Congress was out of session. Presidents love it when Congress is out of session. I suspect they would today, too. And Lincoln virtually created the Union Volunteer Army unilaterally on his own. He called for 75,000 that first time. Shortly, he'd call for another 42,000, and then he would call for them by the hundreds of thousands. One of his calls was for 300,000 soldiers, this on top of several 100,000 already in arms, and it was that call for 300,000 that led to one of the war's most famous songs, "We Are Coming, Father Abraham, 300,000 more." And that wouldn't be the last of those big calls. But it's one of the first times, interestingly, that in the public mind the term father is attached to Abraham. And it will happen again and again. Lincoln understood instinctively, like Washington before him, that with this massive army growing and with these men facing this tremendous challenge to save the Union, he had to instill in them not just a sense of loyalty to the nation, but a personal loyalty to himself. He understood from the start, I think, the value, for one thing, of being visible. Previous presidents were not seen much. There was no television, there's no photography to speak of. Previous presidents stayed in the White House. You could go there and see one if you wanted to stand in line, but you rarely saw them otherwise. Lincoln seemed to understand that the men needed to see him. He was trying, I think, to make himself a symbol of the cause they were about to try to defend with their lives. And so as those first volunteers came into Washington, a city, by the way, that was almost surrounded and cut off in April and May of 1861, because, as you know, it's essentially a southern city. When those first regiments from the north came in, when the Massachusetts regiments, the 7th New York, the 1st Rhode Island, as they arrived, Lincoln was at the wharf at the Navy Yard to meet them. And it began a tradition that he continued for the balance of the war, of meeting these regiments as they arrived, letting them pass in review, tipping his hat and salute to them, and making sure that he was seen. He personalized himself as president and with the presidency in a way that none of his predecessors had. Moreover, as the camps began to grow all around Washington, Lincoln regularly visited the camps of the soldiers. When he wasn't visiting their camps, the soldiers were visiting the White House. Imagine this today. In 1861, 1862, a soldier could simply go to the White House, walk in the front door, stand in line. Lincoln had open house 2 or 3 days a week, and perhaps he could get in to see the president. There are other soldiers who didn't even go there to see the president. I found one fellow who simply went to the White House as a convenient place to sit down and write a letter home. They felt that this was the nation's house. Lincoln may have been there. Father Abraham may have been there. But as his spiritual offspring, they had a right to be there as well. And more and more and more of them, while they were there, actually had some kind of personal experience with the man who was going to lead them. And when the first battle came at First Manassas, and the first of many humiliations and defeats, Lincoln did not do what so many others would do, what so many generals did, and blame the soldiers for the defeat. He was out in the camps meeting them when they came streaming back, some of them in panic after First Manassas, to say, "This has not been your fault. We were not behind you as we should have been. Come back, reform your ranks, reorganize. We'll give you better uniforms. We'll give you better weapons. We'll give you better food. We'll stand behind you so that this won't happen again." Sadly, he had to give that assurance time after time until he found the generals who could give him victories. One of the things he did, of course, was to give them a new general after First Manassas, and the fellow he gave them, of course, is George Brenton McClellan, a fellow not nearly tall enough for all that name. And I don't think for this audience I have to rehearse the whole story of the battle that Lincoln fought with McClellan for the heart of the Army. There's no question that McClellan did a wonderful job of reorganizing that Army, of reinstilling a sense of pride in it, a sense of efficiency, a sense of what they could do. He, more than anyone else in those dark days of late 1861 and early 62, made the Army of the Potomac in the East feel that it was truly an army, and that they, when they next went to the battlefield, would eradicate the stain of First Manassas. But unfortunately, he created at the same time a cult around himself within the Army. And it soon became evident that McClellan did not regard even Abraham Lincoln, the president, as his superior. You know what he referred to him as the ape, Lincoln, the original guerrilla, things of this sort. He would keep Lincoln waiting in his anteroom imperiously, and Lincoln put up with it because he knew he had a higher goal than to salve his own ego, something that McClellan would never understand. Lincoln would take anything from just about anybody if he could get out of them what he needed. He was an instinctive executive. He couldn't run a simple country store. You know, he failed twice, but he could run General Motors today. Wish he was running American Airlines at the moment. But Lincoln knew, as time went on and McClellan didn't move, that he might have some kind of a crisis, some kind of a confrontation coming between himself and the general who had what he called the slows. But he couldn't act with McClellan at first because, as he frankly said, McClellan has the Army with him. That was a great strength, but perhaps a great weakness. What Lincoln could do was to visit that Army repeatedly himself, and he did, time after time after time. He would show up for the grand reviews, and McClellan would stage the reviews for Lincoln, probably in part thinking how wonderful it was going to be that the soldiers would see this great contrast between the dignified, prim, upright McClellan and this rather shambling, shabby, somewhat shoddy-looking character riding along beside him on a horse that was frequently shorter than the president was. But what McClellan couldn't grasp was that Lincoln still, because of the common touch within the man, some indefinable quantity he had that we can't really put down on paper, that Lincoln still somehow made a connection to the soldiers when he reviewed them. Equally to the point, he saw hundreds of thousands of them in those reviews in 1862. Furthermore, he stopped and talked to the soldiers. He'd look at their weapons, and he'd listen to their complaints. "You don't like your weapon, my good man? You let me know. If your weapons aren't good enough, we'll get you better ones. If the backsides are worn out of your uniforms, let me know. Don't complain to your officer. Don't go complaining to the quartermaster general. Let me know." Whether he was sincere or not, it had the effect of giving those soldiers to understand that he personally was interested in their individual welfare. By the fall of 1862, when there are still no victories, when McClellan is starting to squander the tremendous store that he has of goodwill among his own soldiers, soldiers in the Army were beginning to look at Lincoln and saying, yes, he's shambling, yes, he's ungainly, yes, he's ugly, yes, he's humorous, but he's the man to suit the soldiers. And it was then that the soldiers started calling him Father Abraham. In October 1862, with only one victory behind them at Antietam, Lincoln made yet another visit to the Army, an Army that he could not get McClellan to move. And this time, as he saw the looks in the eyes of the soldiers and as he talked to them, he saw something different. He came back to Washington in October 62 and said, "I am stronger with the Army of the Potomac than is McClellan. The Army now is with me." And what did that allow him to do? It allowed him to fire McClellan. He waited until after the fall elections because, as you know, in midterm elections, inevitably, the party in power will suffer some erosion. Lincoln did not particularly. He still held a safe, though small, majority in Congress, and he held most of the northern governorships that he needed in order to keep those volunteers coming to the Army. But he'd survived the election, he knew the Army was with him, and on November 5th, he didn't hesitate to act in relieving George B. McClellan. The Army, of course, was shocked. The soldiers still loved McClellan, but most of the shock was in the officer corps. You probably, no doubt, heard a lot of stories about incipient movements at mutiny, about proposals to lead the Army on Washington to install McClellan as military dictator. This sort of grumbling, in fact, was confined just to the officers' tents, and especially to a few like FitzJohn Porter and others who were McClellan's oldest and deepest cronies. Among the soldiers in the ranks, you find an entirely different sentiment. Oh, a lot of them were unhappy because they thought McClellan was still the man to lead them, but most concluded that he had to go, even though they loved him. And most important of all, they didn't blame Lincoln for removing him. Happily, they blamed Secretary of War Stanton and all those awful politicians in Washington. So Lincoln got off scot-free. Slick Abe. But that was only the first risk and the first crisis he faced up to that fall. Hard on the heels of the relief of McClellan came the final Emancipation Proclamation, which, of course, he had already tried immediately after the Battle of Antietam. But look at how Lincoln went about it. He knew the uproar it was going to cause in the North and the uproar it could cause in the Army, because armies are, by their very nature, essentially conservative, small c organizations. But a great many of the men in the Army had been Democrats, or were Democrats as well, who might not have approved of the idea of making a war to preserve the Union now a war to free slaves, about whom many of them did not care, one way or the other. And so he craftily made it a conservative measure and a war measure. You all know, if you've read the proclamation, it didn't free all the slaves. It only freed those that it couldn't free, those who were behind enemy lines. So slavery would continue in Northern Virginia. Slavery would continue in Missouri, Kentucky, parts of South Carolina, parts of Louisiana. What it did was it made emancipation not a social act at that moment, but it made it another weapon of war. Not a humanitarian measure, but another club with which to beat the South. Some men in the ranks were pretty unhappy about it. There were some desertions. A few rampaged, but the soldiers would use any excuse to go rampage a sutler's office. But most of them accepted it, at least as a war necessity. The question of Negro slavery is a hard one, said one New Hampshire soldier. Everyone has a mind of their own about it. I believe in putting away any institution, if by so doing it will help put down the rebellion, for I hold that nothing should stand in the way of the Union. And in the end, that's the attitude that prevailed throughout the Union armies. And as if he had not taken enough risks, this autumn of '62, relieving McClellan, the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln felt secure enough to try to take one more by enlisting freed blacks as soldiers. I won't rehearse the whole controversy over whether or not black troops should be allowed to fight in the war. The proposal was made at the very beginning, and there were repeated attempts during 1861 and 1862. Lincoln actually had to order one of his generals to disband black troops that he was organizing because politically it was at the wrong time and might have worked against the cause. But by late 1862 and early 1863, he felt he was strong enough to take that step. There were problems with some of his own soldiers over it, a lot of problems with some of his officers, but there was also pressure from northern blacks, northern freedmen who said, this is our Union too. We want a part of this fight. After all, they felt the same urges for adventure that young manhood and young womanhood, if allowed, felt universally without reference to color. Moreover, the Emancipation Proclamation made it clear by implication that blacks would have to be accepted as soldiers in the Army. It is a great day for the black man when you tell him he shall carry a gun, said Lincoln. The time has come when I am for everybody fighting the rebels. Let Indians fight them. Let the Negroes fight them. And if you've got any strong-legged jackasses that can kick rebels to death, they have my hearty consent. To Lincoln, it was a weapon of war, or at least that's the posture he presented. When it was suggested that blacks should be put in distinctive uniforms to set them apart from other soldiers, Lincoln said no, they must wear the same uniforms as whites. Now, he was not entirely for leveling. He was not for trying to bring about pure equality within the ranks, and this was not without problems. And if any of you have seen the film Glory, it was done about 10 years ago, you saw a wonderful depiction in that of the uproar within the black regiments over the issue of unequal pay. It was because of a technicality in the enabling legislation. I don't know if the technicality was put there intentionally or not by Lincoln, but by the Attorney General, Edward Bates, in order to pay blacks less. But the point was, it infuriated them. You know, they died just the same as a white man. Many refused to take the pay. They refused to take any pay. They were close to mutiny. Some men did mutiny, and a few were executed for mutinying over the pay issue. Eventually, Lincoln himself solved the problem by asking his Attorney General to look at the existing legislation and reinterpret it. Now, when your president asks you for a reinterpretation, what do you suppose he really wants? And from 1864 onward, blacks got the same pay as white soldiers. And the white soldiers came around in time. Lincoln chided one of them, "You say you will not fight to free Negroes. Well, some of them seem willing to fight for you." And that was what it took. Once men got used to the idea of emancipation, it was easier to accept blacks in uniform. If nothing else, it simply made their load lighter and promised to end the war that much sooner. By 1864, Lincoln clearly was thinking of something even more. He intended all along, historians are unanimous in this, that Lincoln intended from the very outset to declare a universal amnesty for Confederate soldiers when the war was over. But then he asked himself, how could he declare a universal amnesty for the defeated without granting universal suffrage to the victors, which meant the vote for the black man? A man who had an obligation to fight for his country and met it had a right to vote in that country. It didn't come about, of course, in Lincoln's time, but that's the direction he was going. All told, 179,000 blacks became Father Abraham's children. They, too, marched past him in Washington, as did all those countless white regiments. And they saw him face to face, as did those hundreds of thousands of white soldiers. And he looked at them with that same sad, careworn expression that was seen by so many others. In April 1864, he stood on the balcony of Willard's Hotel while some of Burnside's black regiments marched past. It began to rain, and someone suggested that he should go inside. He refused, and instead he raised his hat to the soldiers, as he always did. It was his salute. "If they can stand it," he said, "I guess I can." There, of course, soon on this was the controversy over conscription. After 1862, the soldiers were universally with him. The men already in the ranks are universally behind the idea of conscription and forcing the layabouts and the stay-at-homes to get in the Army as well. Keep in mind that both North and South, repeatedly from the beginning of the war, you have this complaint that it's a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. That the guys from the big families made the war, and it's us poor common soldiers who have to go out and fight it. That feeling was the same both sides of Mason and Dixon's line. And in the mind of the average Union soldier in 1862, it's the rich who were staying home. They could afford to pay substitutes to go in their place. They could afford to pay these large commutation fees, which essentially was a way of buying your way out of service. And commutation helped to finance the Union war effort. But at the prospect of conscription, of forcing these men to go into the ranks, the people already in the Army were universally in favor of it. They thought it was wonderful. In the end, only 46,000 men were actually brought into the Union Army by conscription. But the threat of the social odium of being a draftee impelled 200,000 or 300,000 to enlist to avoid that stain on their reputations. And Lincoln did, it's almost innumerable, the things that Lincoln did to meet the needs for the comfort, such as it was, and the benefit of the common soldiers. He looked after their medical care. He looked into their uniforms. He made sure that their equipment was as good as it could be. He gave them, as I said before, unprecedented accessibility. There was an open door at the White House. Even in the middle of a conference with some generals, if the door to his office was open, he might peek out, see a private soldier, and bring this poor fellow in and make him sit down in front of all the top brass and tell them how the war was going. And a few of them got an earful. "I feel, though the tax on my time is heavy, that no hours of my day are better employed than those which thus bring me within direct contact and atmosphere of the average of our whole people," he said. "They do not want much, and they get very little. All of them, after a while, he referred to as my boys. That image of Father Abraham is constantly growing throughout the war. Mind you, not all of them are grateful or deserving. One absolute jerk named Lieutenant Francis Donaldson from New England, who, by the way, his wartime letters and diary have just been published, in spite of the fact that he's a smug, arrogant ass. It's one of the best books in recent years for an inside look at soldier attitudes and viewpoints in the Army of the Potomac. He called on Lincoln to ask a favor, which he got, and immediately afterward sat down and wrote this letter. The size of the president nearly overcame me. He was, apparently, the tallest man I ever saw, and so thin, too, and so ugly. He had a long, black, double-breasted frock coat which hung like a wrapper on his lean frame, and it was positively the dirtiest coat I ever beheld for a man having any pretensions to gentility. When this homely, dirty, shabby, lean, lanky man appeared, I lost all sense of the dignity of the surroundings and found myself filled with amazement that this was indeed Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. How can foreign nations, or indeed our own people, have respect for institutions when such a slovenly, careless man is the first gentleman of the land? I was the worst disappointed man conceivable. Still, at the end, he had to confess, I came away disappointed at the appearance of the president, but nevertheless entertaining kindly feelings toward him. I think he belongs to the common people. During the war, Lincoln personally welcomed into his White House office for private interviews more than 2,000 soldiers. No one knows how many, but 2,000 is the base. It's bound to be more than that. They came on a variety of errands, wanting help, wanting to get out of the Army, wanting promotions, wanting him to write letters home to their mothers. Many of them were AWOL, wanting him to give them safe passes so they could go back and finish their obligation. Many simply wanted to hold the hand of the man they called Father Abraham. This ready means of access is, I may say, under our form of government, the only link or cord which connects the people with the governing power. However unprofitable much of it is, still it must be kept up. He also understood that every soldier who left his office departed with a story that he was going to tell. He was going to dine out on this in the camps for the rest of the war and for the rest of his life. Every soldier who left his office was a personal ambassador for the president and for the war. They all had pretty much the same experience. When he welcomed them in, he shook their hand. Now, he, of course, was 12 feet taller than they were, so he would reach down, and it was always described as being like shaking a pump handle. He would grab their hand and go up and down 2 or 3 times. Then he would invite them to sit next to him on a sofa, or he'd sit them in a chair and draw another chair up right in front of them, as close as we are. Rest his chin in his hand and say, "What can I do for you, my boy?" And then with his eyes intently on the man in front of him, he listened. Imagine a president who listens. And they told their story. Sometimes he put his hand on their knee. This would be mistaken today. But in that era, or put an arm around their shoulder. But in that era, it was a fatherly gesture, not at all misunderstood. And those soldiers who'd been with him, even if they got nothing more out of them than a kindly shake of the hand, went away with a tremendous feeling. I promise not to try to relate any of this to what's going on now. But you know, one of the comments you hear more often about President Clinton is that when he speaks to someone, they have the feeling that he was interested in nothing but them. Whether he is or not is another matter. Whether Lincoln was interested or not is another matter. But Clinton is at least Lincoln-esque in the fact that he can give someone the understanding that for those moments that they're together, there are not 4 billion other people on the planet. That's a powerful feeling for the head of state to be able to give to someone who serves under him. And you can imagine what that did for the morale of the armies when those men told those stories at their campsites. Of course, he kept up the visits to the armies. Interestingly, Lincoln never visited the armies of the West under Sherman and Grant. He could have, certainly. The transportation was available. But those armies were never troubled. He never fought a battle with them as he did with McClellan. Those armies had an almost unbroken chain of victories from the very beginning. It's that poor Army of the Potomac, Mr. Lincoln's army, that is the one that was so troubled from the very outset, and that's where he concentrated his attention. He continued the reviews. They were almost always the same. He came along as an ungainly writer, often holding his hat to keep it from flying off, his coat, that dirty coat, flying in all directions. Sometimes he was put, probably by McClellan, on a small donkey that made him look even more ungainly. Holding on for dear life as he galloped along, frequently his pant legs would creep up his legs and his long johns would stick out. He looked ludicrous. But the soldiers didn't laugh. Everyone who kept a diary after the review would write in his diary, "The president reviewed us today," and they give these descriptions of this cartoonish appearance. But it was not funny. Instead, interestingly, you find that universally they all have the same description of the president: sad. And they all use one adjective to describe him: careworn. The officers were shocked by his appearance, but the soldiers responded. They didn't laugh, even when a branch knocked off his hat, because what stopped them was his face. "We thought there must be a heap of trouble on the old man's mind," wrote one. Often he seemed to stare distractedly at the ground. "I could feel nothing but pity as I looked at him," said one soldier, and remembered the weight of the responsibility resting on his burdened mind. What an ordeal he has passed through, and what is yet before him. His universal salutation to the regiments was to lift his tall stovepipe hat, often thousands of times, and often too thousands at a single time. Yet repeatedly you find those examples of an individual soldier out in those masses who believed that when Lincoln looked at them, or smiled, or saluted with his hat, that he was addressing his gesture not to the mass, but to that soldier individually. Time after time in their diaries, "I had the feeling that the president was looking at me." A powerful feeling. Blessed with that common touch, Lincoln was seen personally during the war by more than 500,000 of his soldiers. And across the North, he'd been seen in the flesh by more people than any president before him, or more than any president after him, until our century, and until the days of the newsreel. Seeing the president in the flesh has a heavy and powerful sense of identification with the man you've seen. As an infant, I saw Harry Truman. I have no recollection of it, but it's still one of my favorite stories because I actually saw Harry Truman. I was born in his town, though Harry doesn't seem to have remembered much about seeing me. It didn't have the same impact. Moreover, and this is important and not much appreciated, Lincoln allowed one of the latest technological developments to be used to his advantage in molding that army and the nation behind it to him. Photography had come in, of course, in the late 1830s and was spreading rapidly throughout the country. By 1860, there were more than 1,000 photographers, north and south. Presidents tended not to sit for the camera very often. During their terms of office, Andrew Jackson, of course, had no photos taken during his term of office. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan had maybe half a dozen photos taken while in office. With Buchanan, the fewer the better. Lincoln was photographed at least 100 times that we know of. But that's not what's important. What is important is that the facilities were available for the mass production of those photographs. And you find Lincoln's image throughout the North. Go to a flea market today and pick up an old carte de visite album, you know, those small photos about this big carte de visite from the French for visiting card. They were very popular for collecting in that era. And you can hardly find a carte de visite album from the 1860s, full as it is of obscure civilians. You have no idea who they are. They're all members of the family. But somewhere in there, and probably on the first page, is a CDV of Abraham Lincoln. His face was in every household. Many of the soldiers carried his face with them on the battlefield. It was public relations, 1860s style, at its finest. Of course, in addition to all this, nothing won him the loyalty of soldiers more than his vaunted kindness and charity. The stories of Lincoln's pardon and amnesty have become part of American mythology now, but there's a lot of truth behind them. The Union Army had at least 100,000 courts-martialed during the course of the war. Interesting, 1 out of every 20 soldiers was court-martialed. This is what happens in an army of civilians who were on loan to the military, who don't always take to military discipline. There are, of course, dozens of causes. The articles of war are enormous. Hundreds of these cases wound up on Lincoln's desk, and his approach to them was virtually his maxim. Fair play, he said, is a jewel. Every opportunity he got, he would mitigate the sentences. Interestingly, he almost always overturned any sentence for a soldier that involved withholding his pay. because Lincoln had known what poverty was like, and he knew these soldiers came from poor families, and withholding pay from the soldier meant he still ate, of course, but the soldier who sent his money home to a family that depended on him, having his pay withheld, would visit a hardship on the family at home. Anyone who showed sincere atonement for their infractions received mercy from Lincoln. He always showed mercy in the case of insanity. He always showed mercy in cases of drunkenness because he understood human weakness and frailty. He liked to teach people a lesson, so there were times when he withheld his amnesty for a while. On numerous occasions when a man was to be shot for desertion or some other high crime, Lincoln's amnesty didn't show up until the man was in front of the firing squad. Sadly, some Union commanders who thought Lincoln was too lenient knew this policy of his, and sometimes they would have men shot a day before they were supposed to be, so that Lincoln's amnesty arrived too late. He was patient with insubordination on the part of the soldiers. He knew what anger was like, and he knew what bad officers could be like. One crime that carried the death penalty was striking an officer. Lincoln decided that the cure in a volunteer army was to pass a law, he said, that a private shall have a right to knock down his captain. Okay, not all of his ideas were good. But certainly they showed his understanding for the frustrations of a man who was not born to be a soldier. And he was extremely patient with cowardice. He liked to tell, as many did, the story, always told of an Irishman for some reason, who was as brave as he could be until he got on the battlefield, but then for some reason his legs would always run away with him every time. Lincoln called people who ran away in battle his leg cases. No one need ever expect me to sanction the shooting of a man for running away in battle, he said, and more than once he said, if as I was in battle, I would probably do the same thing. At one time, there were as many men absent without leave from the Army of the Potomac as there were actually on the field, more than 250,000 men, AWOL. The volunteer soldier felt he had a right simply to walk away and come back when it suited him. Being absent without leave could also be a shooting offense. But interestingly, hundreds of these men came to the White House when they came to their senses and came to Lincoln himself to say, I'm sorry for what I've done. I want to go back and serve out my time. But of course, they were in danger of being captured, being taken prisoner by the provost and being tried as deserters. So Lincoln would give them a safe conduct back to the Army so they could serve out their time honorably. And of course, there's desertion. Desertion became endemic, or pandemic, by 1864. This is traditionally in all wars that the men with the greatest motivation are those who enlist earliest. After 3 years of war, so many of those men were dead, or their times of enlistment had expired, and more of the Army is filled with conscripts, men who've been paid money in bounties to enlist, men who've been hired as substitutes, and frequently their courage was not quite up to what it had been at the beginning of the war, and so desertion would increase dramatically. Time after time, when Lincoln dealt with deserters, he would do the same thing. He would give them the option of going back to their regiments, serve out their time, or re-enlist for the war in order to avoid the ultimate penalty that so many of their officers wanted them to pay. In part, as he said over and over again, he wanted these men after the war to have a sense of pride in what they had done during the war. He knew that he was going to win. But what kind of pride can a man have in victory when he's deserted a year or 2 years before that victory? Already he was looking ahead to the sense of pride in his manhood and pride in his volunteer spirit as an American who's met his obligation to his country for these men and trying to help the wavering and those who were who had leg cases of their own to enjoy that same spirit and pride that he wanted all soldiers to have. The buildup of these cases was enormous. One day in April 1864, Lincoln personally reviewed 67 court-martials. Eventually, he would issue a blanket amnesty for deserters and a commutation of all death sentences, and he would have to do this again and again because they kept building up. Always his theory was, I don't believe it will make a man any better to shoot him. And he was probably right. The day of execution, when executions were held in the Army, was usually on Friday. Many who called on Lincoln on Thursday evenings or Friday mornings would find him already suffering a headache and walking distractedly in his office because, as he put it, tomorrow was butcher day, and he was fearful he would actually hear the guns going off for the men that he couldn't save. The most famous example of his clemency and it's ironic for a number of ways, is the case, of course, of Private William Scott of New Hampshire. At the very beginning of the war, William Scott, this is when the Army is still just being built around Washington, William Scott is found asleep on guard duty. Sleeping on guard duty is a capital offense in the Army. He was the first, apparently, the first example of this to be found. And so he was brought before court-martial and sentenced to death. Apparently, we're not sure, but apparently Lincoln learned of this and did not call on Scott personally, may not even have called on General McClellan personally, but simply asked him if he couldn't commute the sentence, and if he was afraid that people would think the president was too much of a weakling for not letting this be carried out, he suggested that McClellan might put out the word that it was really Mary Todd who wanted the boy spared. In any case, William Scott was reprieved, sent back to his regiment, and in the Peninsular Campaign in 1862, he was mortally wounded and died. Lincoln never saw Scott. Lincoln did not intercede with his personal presence in front of Scott. So far as we know, he sent a message. That's probably all there is. But a man named Francis Janvier got a hold of this story and saw something in it. And in late 1862, he published a sort of a half-ballad, half-song entitled The Sleeping Sentinel, which has probably been the single most influential piece of literature in the Lincoln and amnesty literature that we have. And in this version, poor Scott was, of course, the son of a widowed mother. The people Lincoln saves are always the sons of widowed mothers. Many of them probably simply never had fathers. They were sort of like... And he'd fallen asleep, but only because he had already pulled 2 guard duties of his own, and he had a sick messmate who couldn't do his guard duties, so Scott took his for him as well. He's almost a messianic figure at this point. He's tried and convicted. The word only gets to Lincoln late at night before Scott is to be shot. And Lincoln, in his bathrobe, races downstairs in the White House, commandeers a carriage or a waiting checker cab, races across the Potomac to McClellan's office, gets up McClellan. They rush out to find the firing squad pointing the gun at William Scott, and they stop it just in time. And Lincoln sends Scott back to his regiment. And Scott, of course, thinks Lincoln's a pretty neat guy. A few months later, when Scott is in fact mortally wounded in the Peninsular Campaign, he is not, as was almost certainly the case, made unconscious by his wound. In fact, he lingers for several hours. And his famous last words, you know that our ancestors of that era spent hours and hours practicing what their last words were to be. All of the last words you read in Civil War stories are bunk. I'm glad I died for my country. What crap. You know, their last words were usually, ah, or ouch, or why didn't I stay at home? Often they simply had no last words. But now William Scott, in The Sleeping Sentry, his last words are, I thank God that I was able to live to justify the President's confidence in me, and that I can gladly lay down my life on the battlefield on the altar of my country's liberty. And furthermore, when his body is searched after his death, it's found that the bullet that has struck him has penetrated not just his chest, but on the way there, it went through the very pardon that Lincoln had given him. And in a later version, it also went through his personal photograph of Lincoln that he carried with him. This is all nonsense. This is all nonsense. Interesting, but it's been filmed repeatedly. And it first appeared on television on one of those early anthology or repertory live TV shows back in the early 1950s. And the fellow playing William Scott was a completely unknown James Dean. The man playing Lincoln was Robert Pastine, who some of you may remember. Well, this was performed. The Sleeping Sentinel was read before Lincoln at the White House, and again on January 1st, 1863, it was read before Lincoln in the Senate, and a big multitude, an assembly of people. And there's no evidence that he ever made one effort to correct it. Well, why should he? Because he could see what that would do, even if it was false. There are times, yes indeed, when it pays for a president not to tell the whole truth. Lincoln in time would be charged for pardoning too much. But the people who attacked him for giving out too many pardons were the same state and national politicians who individually continually appealed to him to pardon men from their states. His attitude, in fact, was, "I wonder whether I have used the pardoning power as much as I ought." He allows or does not interfere with executions in cases of rape or treason, and in some cases of men who repeatedly were bounty jumpers, who enlisted for a bounty, then deserted and re-enlisted again. But otherwise, he gave pardons every opportunity he could. At the end of the War Department reported that there were about 250 military executions during the war. That figure is dramatically low. It's probably 500 or more at least. But that there weren't more is due to Abraham Lincoln, who, among other things, acted as a great social leveler in the Army, and the soldiers understood it. Of those 400 or 500 men who were executed, not one was an officer. In the entire course of the Civil War in the Union Army, we don't have records for the Confederate Army. In the Union Army, not one officer, no matter what he did, including rape or murder, not one officer is ever given the death sentence. Because, of course, his court-martial is fellow officers who take care of their own. But they would pass it out to the soldiers in the ranks. Lincoln understood that, and the one act of social leveling he could do would be to make sure that the soldiers got the same break that the officers gave themselves. And whenever he pardoned a soldier, he would say, "Well, I have made one family happy." He gave hundreds of pardons, general amnesties, blanket suspensions for executions. He was accused of impairing discipline in the Army, but in fact, I think he improved it by showing the volunteers that there was mercy and there was justice, even for the lowly private, and that sometimes Lincoln himself was the only protection the soldiers had from their own officers. And by 1864, the soldiers were returning what Lincoln had given to them. There isn't time to go into all the background of the election of 1864, but you know that by then war weariness was setting in the North tremendously. The military campaigns were stalled. Grant was holed up at Petersburg. He'd taken Lee out of the Army, essentially, as an open field general, but nothing was happening. Sherman seemed to be stalled in North Georgia. The casualty lists had kept mounting inexorably. And there was some fear, even in Lincoln, that he might not be renominated, or that if renominated, he might not be reelected. And then the Democratic Party, my party, as it so often does, self-destructed. They nominated George B. McClellan. The Chicago Convention in August nominated Little Mac, as he was called, and as his running mate, George Pendleton, virtually a copperhead, a man who had spoken out against the war effort from the very beginning. Worse, the Chicago platform called for the reinstatement of slavery, the abrogation of the Emancipation Proclamation. This especially was not going to go over well with those 200,000 black soldiers. It declared the war a failure and called for negotiations with the Confederacy. It was perhaps the most incredible misjudgment of the sentiment of the American people in history, until perhaps the other party's misjudgment in our own times over the sentiment of the American people about impeachment. What the Chicago platform said to the Northern people was that their sons and their brothers and their husbands' hardships were wasted and that hundreds of thousands had died for nothing. That is not a way to win votes. Little Mac himself, to his credit, disassociated himself from the Chicago platform, pledging that he was for reunion by whatever means necessary, but he could never escape the defeatist company he kept with Pendleton and with that platform. His support in the Army eroded rapidly and dramatically. "Goodbye, Little Mac," said one soldier supporter. "If that's the company you keep, Uncle Abe gets my vote." No soldier could vote for him on that platform. And then Sherman took Atlanta, a major boost, not just in the Army, but throughout the Northern population. The soldiers maintained a tremendous political debate in the camps all during that campaign. There were stump rallies and campaigns, even in the prison camps in Andersonville. The prisoners held debates, and they held mock elections. Probably 1864 saw the most informed and motivated political discussion among our armed forces of any wartime election in our history. Of course, there is the issue of voting in the field, because most states would not allow soldiers to vote unless they were at home. And Lincoln dealt with that, as you know, and many states actually wound up allowing their soldiers to vote in the field. And in the end, all the risks he'd taken, relieving McClellan in '62, emancipation, the draft, enlisting black soldiers, all of those risks came to work for him, as they were all perceived as more weapons in the overriding cause of winning the war, reuniting the Union, and sending the soldiers back home. Lincoln had gambled repeatedly on the support of the men in the ranks, and in 1864 he won the jackpot, as they supported him overwhelmingly. There's only one way to be a true friend to the soldiers, one man wrote, and that is to support Lincoln. The Army is for old Abe. On Election Day, 8 out of 10 of the soldiers voted for him, even though half of them had been Democrats before the war. In Sherman's armies out in the West, Lincoln got 86% of the vote. Even in 1944, and as popular as FDR was, he achieved nothing like the share of the soldier vote that Lincoln got 80 years before. Ironically, the soldier vote did not decide the election. In most states, it made no difference at all, and it wouldn't even if every soldier had voted for Little Mac, or if the soldiers had not voted at all. But what was important was that they'd been given for the first time the opportunity to vote. Secession and the Civil War that followed were largely the result of the rejection of majority will in a democracy. And now those soldiers could use their votes alongside their bayonets as weapons to reaffirm their belief in that democracy, the democracy they were fighting to preserve. With the end of the war coming, Lincoln was already looking ahead to peacetime, taking an interest in the benefit of the veterans. He set the tone in his second inaugural when he spoke about charity for all, and for caring for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. He'd formed a new compact with veterans for the government to take care of those who had defended it. He planned institutionalized care for the disabled. Out of Lincoln's plans came the first veterans hospitals. Eventually, more than $5 billion in pensions would be paid out by 1917, and by the time all Civil War Union pensions were paid out, they had cost the government 4 times what the war itself had cost. He foresaw employment in government jobs for the soldiers who were disabled and couldn't go back to their civilian jobs. He oversaw creation of orphans' homes and soldiers' asylums. And he also took an interest in the special problem of some of his black soldiers. If a black soldier had a wife, most likely it had been a slave marriage, without benefit of clergy, without benefit of a marriage license, without benefit of any legal sanction. If that soldier fell in battle, that marriage wouldn't be recognized and his widow would not be eligible to collect his pension. Lincoln started legislation to ensure that slave marriages were regarded as legally binding, so that the widows of black soldiers could get pensions just like the widows of white soldiers. He was surrounded by the soldiers even to his death. He was in the box at Ford's Theater on the evening of April 14th. The last song he heard was a brand new tune composed entitled Honor to the Soldiers. Just before the last act started, probably the last words he spoke to an immortal man were to Major Henry Rathbone, a soldier. And when he was carried across the street to the Peterson house where he died, they put a coverlet over him, but beneath the coverlet next to him as he died was a simple soldier's blanket. The reaction of the soldiers was predictable, and at first violent. There was fear of rioting in the streets in Washington. Anyone of Southern birth or name or sympathies was advised to stay at home. And indeed, there are numerous examples, not in Washington, but throughout the South, of anyone who uttered a word of condonement, of approval for the death of Lincoln, being taken out into the woods and not coming back. As one soldier said, it seemed as if we had lost a father. They idealized him, and they mythologized him, and they made him one of their own. You may have a book by William Powell. It's a massive history of the Fifth Corps. It's one of these really bizarre unit histories. It's about this big, and it's got a very strange organization, which is not unusual. It has 5 separate indexes. 1 index for civilians, 1 index for battles, 1 index for soldiers. No civilians are referred to in the index for soldiers, except 1. All references to Abraham Lincoln appear with his soldiers and not with the civilians. Coming into our own century, the silent movies discovered Lincoln. Then you see The Sleeping Sentinel, made over and over again. If any of you have seen D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, you've seen in there a version of The Sleeping Sentinel. And you see Lincoln referred to as what by Lillian Gish? The Great Heart. That's how the soldiers, after the war, took him to their hearts. Half of all the movies that show Lincoln, in fact, are silent films, and they all turn around his famous acts of charity and his amnesty. He had become Father Abraham to millions, and especially to his soldiers, by inspiring them to come forward to save the Union, by appealing to their own better natures, to their own better angels to see the war through, and by caring for them when they were in uniform. He promised them the pride they would feel in posterity at having stood by their country. He helped to keep up their courage and to keep up their determination to see the thing through. He began the tradition of obligation and civic duty that thereafter has sent American men and now American women off to war. The term public relations was unknown in 1861. How nice if it would be still unknown. Yet Lincoln instinctively understood its nature and its powerful potential, and he used it craftily. By being seen repeatedly, and by hundreds of thousands, by placing his image before millions, he built not the cult of personality of the modern penny dictator, but instead he fostered a loyalty based on his appearing to be one of them, accessible, unpretentious, a common man, though he was, if anything, not a common man. And by his much publicized charity and humility, his undeniable humanity, and also by his unrivaled mastery of the language to appeal to the people with words, for sadly words were far more important to Americans then than today because they meant so much more. By all these things, he was able to persuade the volunteers that he never forgot their welfare. Listen to perhaps the three most famous utterances, the three most famous things to come from Lincoln's pen: the Gettysburg Address, the Second Inaugural, and the famous Widow Bixby letter. Separate yourself from the music and the rhythm of the words, and what is there in the meaning? Concern for the welfare of the soldiers and concern to finish out the war and save the Union. That's the message he brought to the soldiers year after year. That he'd shared their sufferings, they had little doubt. They had but to look at that careworn face. And like so many of their own, he died as a soldier died, only his battlefield was Washington. Don Piatt, a journalist and himself a war veteran, wrote that Lincoln taught the world to know us. Washington taught the world to know us. Lincoln taught us to know ourselves. The first won for us our independence, and the last wrought out our manhood and self-respect. There's a wonderful 1862 marching song that I'm happy to tell you I am not going to sing to you. It has an almost irresistible rhythm to it, though. The Yankee boys have started out the Union for to save, and we're marching down to Washington to fight for Father Abe. Rip, rap, flip, flap, strap your knapsack on your back. We're going down to Washington to fight for Uncle Abe. Forever after, when American men and women donned uniforms to defend their nation, or the civilization of which they were a part, they answered the same call that 2 million men strapped on their knapsacks for in Uncle Abe's war, and out of a sense of duty and patriotism that he helped to instill not just in his own time, but for all time. Had they not come forward, and had they not kept coming, there might have been no United States as we know it to lead nations in resisting the totalitarianism of the 20th century. Perhaps it was all the same fight, really, whether in 1861 or 1917, 1941 or 1990. And as millions after him left their hearths to take their roads to war, they were all on their way, Lincoln's boys, fighting for Father Abraham. Thank you all very much. Any questions?
Questions and wait for the microphone
sure.
to represent
Be happy to undertake any questions. The men's room's back there, if that's one of them. Just raise your hand, and Mike here will have the microphone. Yes, sir.
How did Abraham Lincoln get out of the spotlight of firing McClellan in the fall of '62? I mean, how did he do that? Give it to, make it fall on Stanton?
The question, if you didn't hear it, is how is it that Lincoln didn't seem to bear the heat for firing McClellan in November 1862? It's one of those little miracles of history. I can't find that Lincoln did anything overt himself to say, he made me do it. I think what happened instead, based at least on what the soldiers say in their letters and their diaries, is that they had developed a sufficient affinity for Lincoln by them that they didn't believe that he would do it of his own accord. So they found scapegoats for him. And so what you find is, the other interesting thing, of course, is that it also shows that by 1862, in the soldier's mind, Lincoln is not part of the political establishment in Washington. You have Lincoln, and you have the government. Lincoln's sort of in charge of the government, but when he has to do something unpopular, it's the damn government that makes him do it. I'm sure Lincoln was not at all unhappy about this misunderstanding, but as near as I can tell, he did nothing to try to bring it about. Yes, sir. Let's wait till he gets the microphone.
Thank you. Did Lincoln ever suspect that George McClellan was in the pay of a foreign government to sabotage the Union war effort?
Did Lincoln ever suspect that McClellan was in the pay of a foreign government like the Confederacy to sabotage the Union war effort? I'm not aware of anything like that. McClellan's a pretty dreadful character, but he's gotten probably more bad press than he deserves. McClellan was a true patriot. He simply was a man who did not have, I think, the moral courage to lead an army in battle. There's a great deal. He was certainly no physical coward, but there's a big difference between being brave yourself and having the courage to take the responsibility for what's going to happen if you lose. And McClellan seemed to be unable to do with that. But, for instance, when there's talk of the army rising and marching on Washington to depose Lincoln, McClellan himself won't hear a thing of it. I'm not sure that Lincoln would have thought. I don't think Lincoln thought McClellan would have been capable of that kind of treason. Incompetence, yes, but treason, no. Yes, sir.
Everybody knows that we send agents in Europe to recruit German and Irish soldiers. Was that Lincoln's idea or Stanton's?
The question is that we had sent agents in Europe to recruit German and Irish soldiers. Was that Lincoln's idea or Stanton's? Actually, that's largely a myth created by the Confederates so that they could say, look, we're fighting Lincoln's hirelings. See, the real men of the North won't fight us. They're not behind Lincoln's war, so he has to bring Hessians over here. In fact, of course, the Confederacy had plenty of Irish themselves. Well, Pat Claiborne, was as Irish as they come. They had whole regiments of French and Irish immigrants from Louisiana, for instance. That was okay. But when these regiments of Germans, most of whom had been living here since the 1840s, the overwhelming majority of the immigrants fighting in the Union Army had come over as refugees from those wars of unification in Central Europe in the late 1840s. So they were citizens. They were property owners. They were taxpayers. There are a few examples because there were bounty and enlistment agents who would go out and try to sign up people in this country. There are a few examples that do suggest that some of these guys signed up occasionally a few people abroad. But when Lincoln found out about it, he usually discharged them because they couldn't speak the language. They had no idea what it was they'd signed up for. They just met this nice American who gave them money, and that's when we became famous for going overseas with lots of money. Yes, sir.
Me?
Yeah.
Yes. Is there any thought, or was there any entertainment of the idea of Lincoln appointing Garibaldi to take over the American army?
Not that I'm aware of. The question was there any talk at the time of Lincoln appointing Garibaldi, the man who's unifying Italy, of course, and who's quite a hero to people over here, of appointing him to command the Union Army? I've never seen anything to that effect. I think you did find some of the Italian-American community proposing that Garibaldi, their great hero, should be brought over here, but at the time he had his hands quite full in Italy. Plus, Lincoln had found over and over again that while there was some political benefit and enlistment benefit to giving high command to some of these foreign nationals, Franz Sigel, Karl Schurz, and other men whose names essentially the soldiers couldn't pronounce, why more often than not they tended not to be very good on the battlefield. This is not because they were not Native Americans, simply because they'd been failed generals in Europe. So why should they be any better generals over here? Yes, miss.
Yeah, with the apparent open-door policy that Lincoln had for soldiers coming in and out, and the fact that there were spies in Washington at the time, were there any attempts on Lincoln's life that way, or did any information ever get out from the Capitol through spies to the lines?
As for the attempts on Lincoln's life, certainly there were no attempts that we know of on the part of someone who came into the White House to have a talk with him. We do know that his hat was knocked off by a bullet when he was out riding in his carriage one evening. Of course, he went about the Capitol completely unprotected. It's impossible to think of this today. The president had 2 secretaries to handle his correspondence. He finally got a third one after it took a lot of persuasion with Congress to get them to let him have money for a third secretary. And of course, he rode around with he had a guard attached to him, but he usually preferred to go without it. And so he was an easy mark for anyone who would wish to have tried to assassinate him. There is the one assassination attempt that we know of, but no one was ever caught. The other part of your question about information coming out of Washington, all the Confederates ever had to do was get a Washington newspaper, and it was all there. But I'm not aware that there were any leaks by, in modern parlance, from the White House itself. But Washington, remember, is a southern city. It's essentially a Virginian and Maryland city. And so most of the office workers had southern attachments, and it was very, very easy for information to get out of Washington, sadly. Yes, sir. Just a second till he gets there.
Is it your feeling that these strange coincidences that surround Lincoln's assassination are just that, coincidences?
Yeah, the coincidences surrounding Lincoln's assassination.
The only way out
a lot of the stories that we get today are in the last generation about, like all the telegraph lines in Washington being cut when Lincoln was shot. Well, that's true. The civilian lines did cease to function, but the military lines worked all through the night and were operating constantly. Routes out of the Washington being unguarded, several in fact were. Most of these stories are exaggerations you can trace back to a fellow named Otto Eisenschimmel, who wrote a very undeservedly influential book called, what was it, Why Was Lincoln Murdered, or something like it, and a couple of others. It's essentially they're the ravings of a paranoid. But we love conspiracies, and so they go on to this day. And yes, sir. I'm sorry, Mike.
Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in the early. Now, had any president before or since ever done anything like that? And how did Lincoln personally feel about taking such a drastic act?
The question was about Lincoln suspending the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. Had any previous presidents done that? I'm not aware of it. I can't testify that none did, but I'm not sure there were any emergencies that would have called for it, except perhaps during the War of 1812, when, of course, Washington has fallen. Lincoln justified it when he did it. And, you know, the cases in which he did it, Lambton, Milligan, it's mostly, and others, from which we have the famous Supreme Court case, Ex parte Milligan, mostly with those who are active dissenters against the Union war effort, who he fears could actually cause genuine harm to the Union war effort. Lincoln justified habeas corpus the same way his opposite number across the lines justified it, as a war measure, that in order to preserve constitutional freedom in the long run, you must occasionally abridge constitutional freedom in the short run. And of course, both Lincoln's and Davis's opponents would seize on this every time there was a suspension of the privilege of the writ, saying, dictator, we have a military tyrant in our hands. Davis, by the way, suspended the writ far more than did Lincoln, and mostly in cases of people who were illegally distilling alcohol. Was there one over here, Mike? Yes, sir, back there.
The election of 1864. I may be wrong, but I thought Lincoln won by 400,000, and that would be less than 80% of the soldiers. So when you said that soldiers didn't really carry the election for him, I was just wondering about the numbers.
I'd be here for another hour and a half if I tried to analyze this for you. Essentially, remember that what's important is the electoral vote. And Lincoln took all the big states. And we don't even know what the soldier vote was from a few of the states. They were not tallied separately. We do know from a number of them that we have the civilian vote, Democrat, Republican, and we have the soldier vote. And in many cases, we can clearly see that if even all the soldiers from that state had gone for McClellan, the civilian majority he had at home would still have been enough to give him the electoral count for that state. But yeah, as is often the case, Lincoln's electoral majority is completely out of balance with his actual popular vote majority. But we're pretty certain. I think we're on pretty safe ground to say that the soldier vote would have decided some congressional races that might have impaired Lincoln's majority in Congress in his second term, but that it wouldn't have affected the outcome of the presidential election. Maybe one more. The gentleman back there?
What was Lincoln's...
I'll just repeat it. Oh, hold on just a moment.
What was Lincoln's relationship with Grant?
What was Lincoln's relationship with Grant? I think a fairly ideal relationship of a commander-in-chief and general-in-chief in a civil democracy in which the civil authority is to maintain primacy over the military. I would liken it perhaps to FDR's relationship with George Marshall. Lincoln, as long as Grant was doing something and keeping Lincoln informed, Lincoln stayed out of his way. Jefferson Davis is the president who gets a lot of bad press for all the interfering with generals. In fact, he didn't do that much. Lincoln did far more, but he interfered only with those generals who weren't doing something, which, by the way, is what Davis did as well. Grant did things. We don't know that there's not much evidence of what kind of personal relationship they had. Grant, of course, had been a Democrat before the war. Grant hadn't been all that keen on the Emancipation Proclamation. But Grant fully understood his duty as a soldier in a constitutional democracy, and there was never any question of who was in charge. Grant gave Lincoln every cooperation he could, and when Grant needed something, Lincoln got it in return. You could liken it to the relationship of Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee, though the difference is the Lincoln-Grant relationship worked because they both were great at what they were doing. They were perfect for their jobs. I think the Davis-Lee relationship worked because Robert E. Lee knew how to handle Jefferson Davis. Big difference. Okay, just one last minute.
When Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox and the way he was treated, do you think that's reflective of the kind of person that Lincoln was, the graciousness with which Lee was treated at that point?
We don't know everything about what Lincoln's full post-war policy was going to be, but all the hints we have are that his idea was, as Grant was, to say, let him up easy. Lincoln actually was on record as hoping that, for instance, that Jefferson Davis would escape. He didn't want to have a show trial of the leading rebel. He wanted to let everything just kind of die. He was already trying to bring the government of Louisiana, among other states, back into the Union on a reconstructed basis, the 10% plan that allowed, it's too complex to get into now. But the point is, he did not want a hard hand of peace to follow the hard hand of war. And I think we can, counterfactual history saying what if is pointless, but I think we're safe in assuming that what Reconstruction became, which is not nearly as bad as it's been painted, but still what it became would have been easier yet on the South if Lincoln had been there to direct it rather than a fairly vindictive Congress. But then Congress is always vindictive. Thank you all very much.
We'd like you to remain in your seats for just a moment. As Al explained, when we do the book signing, the process, as always, is to purchase the book and then line up, and our guest, Jack Davis, will be happy to sign it. As a token of our appreciation, the North Shore Civil War Roundtable, we always have a little plaque, and sometimes we wish it was bigger, to give our speaker. It reads, "An appreciation to William Davis, February 11th, 1999, from the North Shore Civil War Roundtable." And again, let's have a nice round of applause for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you for coming.
Let's look at my wife. She's going to take another picture. Let's stand over here a little.
Thank you. Terrific. Good evening. Hello, hello.
To Peter, please.
Jack,
There we go.
question.
Thank you. Sure enough.
Question. Lincoln seriously entertained putting Reynolds in charge at the time, or was that just another story?
I believe the offer was made,
He
but
really
I'm
did.
not. That's a little out of my
That's a
line, the
little bit
military.
out.
But I believe the offer was made.
Was made stuff,
Yeah.
okay.
And Reynolds turned it down.
Okay, he officially turned it down or unofficially?
That I don't. I'm not sure that there's any document that shows that. But don't trust my word for it.
Okay.
But I think everybody agrees that he had it if he wanted it.
If he wanted it, right. Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Very entertaining and informative. Thank
Good evening.
How come you have two names? You have Jack.
You don't have long enough to hear the story. And it's not interesting either. I just never liked the name Bill, mainly. Goes back to junior high, which is now so long ago I can't remember it.
Yeah, that goes way back.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Hello again.
You made history come along.
Oh, thank you.
No, thank you, really. And can I ask you a question?
Sure enough.
Who's your favorite Confederate general?
Oh, probably John C. Breckinridge, who's not one of the big ones, but I wrote my first book about him, and he's just a very interesting character.
Okay. Mine's Pete Longstreet.
Well, you have a lot of, he's flavor of the month these days.
Why do you suppose is really this whole resurgence of the Civil War all of a sudden?
Well,
or is it just me?
It's not. It's
See, I'm a special ed teacher, so I don't do this kind of stuff.
I think the interest started during the war and never ceased.
stopped.
There were just it's sort of little peaks and valleys. But
We're going to move.
certainly the Ken Burns series had a lot to do with it. The Civil War Journal series had a lot to do with it. The film's glory, and especially the Killer Angels movie, Gettysburg. And, you know, even during the Revolutionary Bicentennial, nobody got interested in it, but that gave the Civil War a surge of popularity. So it's just something that's always with us. It just comes and goes a little bit.
Jack, thank you so much.
You bet. Thank you.
It was a pleasure meeting Jennifer.
Okay.
Thanks.
Good evening.
I hope this is okay to bring some
Oh, I'm
of your older
delighted.
work.
One of my old sins, right. How would you like it inscribed?
Just to Richard.
Okay.
I'm impressed by the fact that you can keep on coming with these great photos. Are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, I'm doing a biography of Robert Barnwell Rhett, the fire eater from South Carolina, and then working on a sort of general political history of the Confederacy. Was this one yours, too?
It is, yes. Which do you prefer to work on, the northern point of view or the southern?
I really prefer working in Confederate history, but it's not out of any, I'm not a neo-Confederate or any particular sympathy. I have ancestors on both sides. When you're from Missouri, you can go either way.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just the sources are more interesting, and I think that trying to form a nation overnight out of nothing is, it's a lot more interesting to see how they tried to do in 4 years what the Union had 80 years to do.
And I take it, of course, that given Lincoln and Northern will, that you don't believe there was anyone that could conceivably win.
No. Not as long as the North was willing to keep fighting. I mean, the North could decide to lose, but the South could never just decide to win, I don't think, without foreign intervention.
Enjoyed this.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Pleasure. Hi.
How are you, sir?
How would you like it inscribed?
Bill Hill? Easy name. I have to ask you a quick question.
Hill, was it?
Hill, yeah.
Okay.
Have a small case glass negative of Lincoln, the 1860 view, Hessler's view without the beard.
Oh, yeah.
Is there anybody that can authenticate anything?
Yeah, you might want to show it to a fellow who's in New York named Harold Holzer. He's at the Metropolitan Museum.
Really?
I think he's PR director or something like that, but he's done 2 or 3 books on Lincoln images. And he, if anybody, and he's practically in your backyard. Harold Holzer, H-O-L-Z-E-R.
Yeah, we bought it in New York City around, I don't know, 15 years ago. Supposedly it came from a Brooklyn family from way back when.
Wow. Well,
It's an 1860 case. And
he would be able to.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Good evening. Hi.
How are you?
Just fine. How would you like it described, sir?
Susan and Jim. Did Lincoln not pick Hancock because he was a Democrat?
For
When he picked, well, he first tried for Reynolds.
When he put Meade in command?
Yeah.
Well, now, I don't know. So I probably shouldn't venture a guess. Though Reynolds and Meade, I think, were both senior to Hancock. So that alone probably, if Lincoln was going to follow seniority, indeed, I think that's probably why he offered it to Reynolds first. I think Reynolds was slightly senior to Meade in date of commission, but I could be wrong. So that's kind of outside my bailiwick, but Hancock would have been a great choice.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
You bet. Thank you. Hi.
Mark Allen, the captain of Company H, 119th New York. In the same regiment as Pohanka.
How's Brian doing?
I talked to him Saturday night. He's doing very well.
I just heard
He's got
yesterday.
He's got a good head for it. Let me tell you, he told me that he has more vision than he thought he was going to have.
Talk about Brian.
Yeah. He already put an implant in his eye.
Already?
In his socket, yeah. He
Company
just
H?
has- Company H, 119th New York. He's taking a lot better than I would.
You know, the irony is his old boss, Jerry Simons, down at Time Life, died of cancer of the eye.
In fact,
So it's gotta be
I don't
spooky.
even think he knows yet. He said, they're doing forensic tests on the eye now.
Oh, I got told it was a tumor or something. Jesus.
Unbelievable. Yeah, he's having fuzzy vision. Periphery was very fuzzy.
Give him my best next time you talk to him. I haven't seen Brian
I'll
in
probably
quite a
talk
long
to him on Friday.
Yeah.
Probably tomorrow night I'll talk to
Say
him.
hello for me, please, please. Thanks for coming.
Take it easy.
You bet. Good to see you.
Great.
Thank you. Good evening. How would you-
Bill. Should I give you my last name? Stanwell. S-T-A-N-D-W-I-L-L.
I-L-L?
I-L.
Okay.
Stanwell. It's a very nice lecture you gave.
Thank you. Did I cough all through it? I bet I had this little tickle in my throat all
No,
day.
you did fine.
Good, good.
Fine. Thank you
Nothing
very
worse
much.
than being coughed at all.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Hi,
How would I describe this?
Rini, Tarini, R-E-N-E.
It would be Renee if you had the
I know
acute
everybody
accent
would
over
like
it.
to
but
make
That's right.
Thanks very much.
You bet.
I-
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Frank Murley.
You recognize the name?
I sure do.
I wanted to thank you for paying me so much money to
Yeah, would you get-
photographic history.
Would you get $50 a crack or something?
No, it was far more generous than that.
I didn't realize you were up here.
Yeah, I'm at Queens College.
Queens College. Sure, that's right.
You published my first article.
Good Lord.
What Times Illustrated.
Still teaching?
Oh, yes, yes. Thinking of retiring, but still in the trenches.
Still writing for the old firm, are you?
Trying every now and then. Still
I
trying
sort
to
of,
keep my
I've
hand-
kind of lost touch with the Civil War Times, you know, since I left there 8 years ago, oh, Frank, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice, very nice speech.
Thanks very much.
Hi, thank you. Very nice.
Good
Don
evening.
and Millie,
Don and Millie?
any thoughts on the reason for the significance of Lincoln being quiet between November of 60 and March of 61?
Millie
Don
with
and Millie.
I-E or Y?
I-E.
Oh, okay, I just want to make sure I got it. Well, I think, you know, he didn't want to gainsay what the sitting president
Yeah.
was going to do, even though the sitting president essentially did nothing. And I think Lincoln was probably pretty damn scared, too, waiting to see what was
Think
going to
he could
happen.
have done anything? That could have been,
I don't know.
That could have allayed the South.
How much
fury?
moral authority would he have at that point? I mean, he had already said repeatedly, we will not interfere with slavery where it exists.
Yeah.
And the South had chosen not to believe him, and why should they? I don't know what more he could have done. He repeatedly gave that same reassurance.
Just interesting that nothing really happened and they just grew to hate him.
William Davis has authored more than 25 books on the Civil War. His book, 3 Roads to Alamo, was a main selection of the History Book Club. Mr. Davis lives in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. For more information about this book, Lincoln's Men, How President Lincoln Became Father to an Army and a Nation, contact the publisher by clicking on their website at simonsays.com.